Hi, everyone, and thank you, everyone, for joining us. This is our panel discussion called Making Sense of Policy Changes in Canada. My name is Christine Wach, and I'm SVP of Partnerships and Stakeholder Engagement here at IDP for North America. So we are thrilled to be joined today by a distinguished group of panelists from the Canadian higher ed industry. So I'd like to introduce our panelists, so maybe just give a wave or say hello when I introduce you. Craig Riggs, editor of the ICEF Monitor. Welcome, Craig. Livia Castellanos, Vice President, Student Recruitment, Marketing and Admissions, Navitas North America. And Mike Henniger, I can't see you, Mike, CEO of Illume Student Advisory Services. Okay, so I'm going to take a few minutes. This is a fireside chat style webinar. We're taking it back to the days of the pandemic when we used to do this a lot. But I'm going to take a few moments to set the stage for this webinar. So I'm going to start by telling y'all what this webinar is not. Okay, so please don't jump off. Wait to hear what it is about, okay? So we won't be discussing today the IRCC regulations to try to interpret every element. This is being done moment by moment in the media. I'm sure everybody's phone is blowing up right now. Teams messages, emails, WhatsApp. So we're not gonna try and dissect all of them. We're following the situation with everyone as it unfolds. We won't be guessing or conjecturing on how caps will be allocated. We assume some provinces will have more student spots available to them and some less, like Ontario and British Columbia. And we won't be spending the next hour on speculating on how attestation letters will be handled. On the other hand, here's what we're going to do. We will explore how this blunt object approach to sweeping policy updates will impact the Canadian brand and where we will sit in the global policy landscape. We will examine the impact on students and families and institutions, public and private, colleges and universities. We're also going to discuss student sentiment, the confusion and politics surrounding these changes. So first, we're going to start with a little bit of more not so good news. So we just before the policy, the big sledgehammer blunt object policy announcement was made, we had conducted what we call a pulse survey. So that's like a mini survey to students to get their sentiment on recent policy changes that have been announced around the world. We're going to share some of those results, but we closed that survey just before last Monday's announcement. So what we did was reopen the survey and collect more responses. In the initial survey, we did ask students that if there was this pending international student cap, would it impact their decision-making and choosing Canada as their first choice destination to study? So moving on to the next slide, we'll do 2 slides on this. So from our pulse survey, 47% of prospective students said the recent announcements by the Canadian government will have a high or very high impact on their study abroad plans. Moving on to the next slide. 42% of prospective and applied students are now more inclined to choose another destination or reconsider their study abroad plans. So you can see here that 1/3 of prospective students whose first choice was Canada said they are now more inclined to choose another destination or are reconsidering their study abroad plans. Among the students who have already applied to study in Canada, 11% said they are either now more inclined to choose another destination or are considering withdrawing or deferring. So perhaps not surprising. We'll talk about this in the panel. Moving on to the next slide. So we had an opportunity last Friday. The Canada team, 2 of us that are here on shore in Canada and 2 of our colleagues in South Asia addressed a crowd of over 2,000 students and parents in South Asia. And our intention was to give them hope and help them not get too stressed about the latest developments with policy. So a couple of really interesting things came out of this. The students were madly typing questions. So there was thousands of questions from students and parents about these changes. And at one moment, my colleague Rahul, who's based in India, stopped the students and asked them to stop typing and listen because it was a very sort of high stress situation. And what Rahul did was explain to him tried to explain in plain language what was happening. He explained what an attestation letter was. And he then went on to explain what a province was. And he compared it to a state in India. And I think at that moment, and I share this with the panel, I sort of had this light bulb moment that the students didn't know what a Canadian province was. And we were using all this complex language, attestation letters, etc., which really only us Canadian higher ed professionals, immigration professionals actually understand. And to the students, if they don't know what a Canadian province was, it really showed how the impact it had on the families and students overseas who have been spending so much time preparing for this huge decision and journey in their lives. So I think that really struck me that, you know, if we're looking at the student voice and the family's voice from around the world who are trying to make sense of this, I think if we're confused, we can only assume that they're even more confused. Here's a little bit of good news, and then we'll get into the panel. So interestingly, despite the cap, Canada will still accept more international students than many other destinations over the next year. India accounts for about 45% of our global student visas. So at this rate, even with the cap, we will accept, I think it's 160,000 student visas in a year, and that's higher than any other country. So a little bit of context there on the global stage. So moving on to the next slide, these are the themes we're going to look at today: reactions to the announcement, policy and political context, the impact on the Canadian brand, Global Affairs Canada. We're supposed to be releasing Canada's national strategy. How will it change? How should it change? Etc., given the policy announcements. And then just the general level of confusion and uncertainty caused by the announcements. We're also going to dig into some of the feelings that people have been having and some comparisons to the challenges we faced during the pandemic. So with that, I think we can stop sharing the slides and we'll get into it. So we're going to start, with reactions to the announcement. Craig, what was your first reaction to the announcement and the politics of this, if you will?
Yeah, thanks, Christine, and thanks for the chance to be here today. My first reaction, and my reaction still, is that I think it's hard to see this as anything other than an overcorrection on the part of the federal government. And there's no question that there are issues to be addressed in Canada, and no one who is a serious international education professional could suggest otherwise. But instead of targeted policies like we've seen in some other important destinations, the government has opted for what the immigration minister himself has referred to as a blunt instrument in this case. The cap is the main headline item in all of this, but I don't think that that is really a significant feature all by itself, especially given that the actual reduction of new student visas, study permits issued, is likely to be considerably less than the minister has indicated. The bigger issue for me is that Canada has effectively suspended the processing of new study permit applications, at least for the next couple of months. And if that policy remains in place, that's going to have an immediate impact on spring and fall intakes this year, and likely into the following year as well. So the overall impression that I'm left with is that the government of Canada is applying a blunt instrument, as we've said, but one that's also been announced with a lot of haste, undue haste, and as a result is poorly thought through. And so we're left with the type of confusion and uncertainty that you described.
Thanks, Craig. Livia, I'll pass it over to you. Same question. What was your reaction to this announcement?
Yeah, thank you, Christine, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. The first reaction, I was quite surprised because we were talking about a different framework. We went through the verification, we went through the policy of the living expenses for the students. So I thought that this was going to be a longer process. I was very surprised with the reaction of the government in so fast, and also the suspension of all the study permits that are actually in the pipeline. I think that it's very difficult for provincial governments to create a new system to support the students coming to Canada. And I think that this will have perhaps implications. So I am not really in disagreement with this kind of policy. I understand that this is part of the evolution of the Canadian international education, especially, you know, to reinforce what we need to offer and to strengthen Canada as a destination discrimination, but I think that perhaps the approach and the rollout of the policy with such a short period of time, and also taking and punishing all the students who were actually trying to come to Canada in these next 2 semesters, perhaps was a little bit too blunt, and that's a problem. So it was kind of like a shocking reaction. I was expecting a little bit a more extensive timelines for the implementation of all of these.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Livia. Mike?
Well, first, Christine, I want to confirm that there is a time delay on this feed and someone will be bleeping inappropriate language. No time delay. Well, if there's not, I'll have to choose my words carefully about what my initial reaction was on this, because as everyone was, it was shock. But I kind of piggyback on one of Craig's comments of that no international student recruitment professional or international educator was, had the feeling that everything was great in international education in Canada. As we crossed 1 million students in Canada, there was a feeling that, this is getting pretty crazy. And, I look back, been doing some consulting work with the government of Finland, and I spoke at a conference in Helsinki in September. And I was speaking to institutions there and also to some government officials. And I did an exercise while I was on the stage, and I said, please shout out the name of a Canadian city that's not Vancouver, Toronto, or Montreal. And someone from the crowd said Halifax first. And I just typed in Google live on the stage, Halifax international students. And literally the first 10 pages of results came all negative. Housing, tuition prices, lack of jobs. So we were seeing all of this, the feedback on our product and the feedback of the Canada brand wasn't what it like. And Livia, I know you'll talk about your journey in international education and how much things have changed in the past 20 years, but we knew that there were some serious issues that we were facing. I'm not a political animal. I don't follow politics that much, but it was really interesting to see the rollout. And I know when we were at NAFSA, whatever that was in May and June, there was inklings there that the feds were going to be taking some actions and going to be getting involved in limiting. And then we've seen some placements of housing stories in national press, which came down to the regional press. And next thing you know, they're in every newspaper, every radio station, every TV program. And then just this really fast announcement that took everyone by surprise. Not speaking about the collateral damage of some really good schools and people that are going to be dramatically impacted by these measures. And taking that aside, I think if these measures had been rolled out over a 3 to 6 month consultation with the provinces, with our national bodies like CBIE, CICAN, we could have gotten to a place where this wasn't as brand damaging as it is. But people are really freaking out. And I think when you talked about the questions that you had from the students that you gave in South Asia, we're really seeing our agent partners, students in the pipeline, are just hands in the air. What's going on? We thought we could trust the brand of Canada. So just general shock and dismay, especially with the rollout and the political nature of how this occurred.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. So there's a lot of uncertainty, not only in Canada, but across the sector right now in terms of policy changes, UK, Australia. This is for you, Craig, actually, specifically, how do you think these policy announcements will affect the sector generally? What do you think the impact of these policy changes will be for the Canadian brand? We've already heard some examples as a top study destination, both in the short and long term.
I think we've already nodded at the short-term impact in the sense that, particularly because of the effective suspension of study permit processing, this is going to have an immediate impact on spring and fall intakes this year. Students will, as your own survey results suggest, students will delay their study plans, or they will move to a different destination, right? So I think we're going to see that happening to some considerable extent through 2024. How we measure the damage of that over the years to come, I mean, you can think back to the case of Australia, going back now about 10 or 12 years ago, where there was a significant dip in international enrollments. There was a reputational hit to the Australian brand, and it had an immediate impact on enrollments, pushed them down, and it took a period of years for that enrollment base to recover in Australia. So it's hard to say at this point, but I think it's possible that we would see a process of rebuilding foreign enrollment in Canada that's measured out in 3 years or more. So in terms of the brand itself, the damage is in in the form of the market signal that this sends. Something, you know, something that we pay a lot of attention to in our work on ICEF Monitor is the types of signals that destination governments send to the international student marketplace. And we've seen a number of examples of this over the last several years. You know, the Trump presidency in the US, Brexit in the UK, like those are significant political and historical events, but they're also important messages in themselves. And this, I'm afraid, has a similar quality in the sense that it sends a signal to international students in markets around the world that they're not as welcome in Canada as they had been in the past, right? We all know that that's not the case, but it's nevertheless the message that we are in effect presenting to international markets through this type of policy decision.
Mm-hmm. And it seems like, before we jump on to the next question, I think on this theme, there hasn't really been, we've discussed this, a collective counter narrative.
Well, I think you can put that down to the surprise that everyone is feeling, right? It's you know, there has been talk for some time of the government's concern around the rapid expansion of international student enrollment in Canada, and around the some aspects of the student experience in Canada, the quality assurance around that student experience. And those concerns are well-founded, right? There, as Mike just pointed to, like you can find ample evidence of students questioning the quality of their experience, and none of us should be comfortable with that, right? There's obviously measures that had to be taken here, but it's the nature of the government policy that's come forward, including the effective suspension of study permit processing, that has taken everybody by surprise. None of those things, you know, it's not just the four of us that were surprised by that. We're talking about provincial governments, major industry bodies, all important stakeholders in this industry in Canada, which is in itself a major export sector in Canada, are just, you know, if a deputy minister of education in BC is surprised, or if a minister of education in Manitoba is surprised, that's not a good sign, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm afraid that's what happened here. And so the lag in any kind of consistent and unified response to that is I think just a function of just how shocked people were.
Yeah.
Christine,
Thanks.
can I hop in on that really quickly? You know, I had a colleague from Australia say to me that he thought this was the biggest announcement in the history of international education. And I was like, whoa. And I had to stop and reflect on that. And then you start to think, what else has come down from a government or anywhere in the history of what we've been doing of international student mobility that has really matched that. So when you put it in that context of how it impacts so many people, and then, you know, we know the size of the industry. I think CBIE did a really good press release on the impact to Canada, and all of that. And to think about that big of an announcement impacting this large of a sector, and the fact that it was done almost like seemed like over a coffee, where a few politicians like, we need to get into the news cycle. How about this? Great idea, run with that one. And wow, we're here picking up the pieces. So, you know, it's when you think about it in those type of terms, you know, wow.
Yeah.
So especially when we are not building on a strong, optimized foundation. We already had issues with the processing of applications coming to Canada. We already were not competitive compared to Australia, compared to UK, where they have a very expedited process to actually welcome students through their visa processing. So we are building something new on top of something that it wasn't optimal. So that is something that is going to actually bring us into a major set of problems. And that is one of my big concerns. How long is it going to take now? If already took 4 to 5 months, or 3 months to 4 months, or so that's also what I want to add to the conversation here.
Thank you, Livia. I think this theme of overnight change, confusion leads us to that feeling of feeling powerlessness. And I think we saw the numbers for this webinar, how many, it's a record-breaking numbers had registered for that. And I think it's that sense, not only the fabulous distinguished guests that we have here, but also that sense of the need for community to come together after such a shock. And everyone's feeling powerless right now and confused about how to go forward. So Mike, for you, what can we do to impact the situation positively? How do we control the controllable? with this rush rollout, and what can we do to fill in the blanks?
Yeah, and I'm starting to see, like, I'm copied on so many institutions, agent newsletters, and I see the comms going out, and I think people are still trying to scramble and deal with the fact of how do we reply to the IRCC regulation changes. And I feel like already that ship has sailed. And every call we have, it's people trying to pick how the attestation letters, by the way, it's a word I can never say correctly. So why did they pick this word for the letter? The attestation letters, predicting what the allotments are going to be. And we start to go down this, it's a natural cycle. But, you said, how can we control the controllable? And, when I go back to when I started in the public post-secondary, it was in 2010 at Thompson Rivers University. And at that time we had 1,500 international students, no one nationality above 30%. And I always look at the work TRU does as one of the leaders in student recruitment, student supports, and internationalization. We were good. We were out there. We had market-specific plans. We had growth targets and diversity markets that we were really supporting. And we were out there. And then all of a sudden in 2010, we just see this flood of students that started to come based on immigration priorities. They were coming for that permanent residency. So it turned into, you had a seat, you could have a bum in that seat. And unfortunately, a lot of sophistication and a lot of strategy didn't develop with that. And people didn't have to really define their value propositions. People didn't really have to define, what their strategy was and then implement it and execute it in a sophisticated, efficient manner. And I think those crows are going to come home to roost now. So when you come to the controls, like, do you have a really sophisticated comms plan to deal with the students in your pipeline? If you have a bunch of applicants that have applied for fall and you're not reaching out to them with regular webinars and updating them and talking about what your value proposition and telling them that you still want them to come, you're probably in trouble. And I think we see, many schools have been successful despite how they operate because the desire to come to Canada has been so strong. And as we see just from the data that you presented, Craig, that what you were mentioning here on the impact of this policy, the Canadian brand has taken a hit. So as institutions, we really need to take that on. And I feel like, the dropping of the spouse work permit for undergrad students and college students is going to have a big impact on this type of thing. And I look back to 2010, you reflect on how aggressively we were promoting co-op programs because those are really one of the big differentiators for students. So I think schools, have to reevaluate what their value proposition and what their strategy is. And then the second thing, as we went through and we talked about this whole announcement, and you expect when these things come out that there's someone with their hand on the rudder who's guiding the ship forward, and they're guiding it to calm open seas that are full of fish and not to a big rocky shoal that's got a bunch of alligators behind it. And unfortunately, right now we're in the latter. So as we know that there's a lack of leadership from the government here, I really think that we have to have, as institutions, as international educators, a cohesive, consistent message. And it was some of the things that Livia and Craig already mentioned. You're welcome here. This is a bit of a reset. And also the narrative that this is a protectionary measure that to ensure that ethos of quality education that Canada's brand was built upon is being re-implemented, and that we're really focusing on making sure that students come to Canada are coming for the right reasons, having an excellent experience, and getting a quality education. So I really think as leaders and as schools and as communicators, almost moving beyond this reactionary mode of, okay, this press release came out, and we were joking in the prep that it's like a slot machine with the announcements and the WhatsApps coming out, but they never go 777. They're always different, right? And so we, I think, shouldn't get caught up right now in trying to react to what's happening, but really, again, redefining your brand, redefining your value proposition, and really ensuring that you have a calm strategy, and that's aligned and really putting forward the Canadian brand in a way that's going to keep us on the good side of things, as opposed to this deterioration that we're going to see to some extent.
Thank you, Mike. Livia, I'm going to pass it to you now. So could you please share your perspective on the situation? One, as a former international student yourself, who has seen the policy landscape change over the years, and from your experience in leadership roles in both the public, private side of the sector, as well as government.
Sure. I mean, I came to Canada as a student 25 years ago, I think, or more, in 1998. And I arrived in Canada in the era where students didn't have working rights. Students, didn't have a postgraduate work permit. We were coming here, we were studying. There was no opportunity to actually experience the Canadian workforce while we were studying. So the expectation was you finish, you return home, and that's it. When I came back to Canada and I started working in universities, at the University of Regina was my first appointment. Over the years, I have seen the evolution of a lot of policies that have impacted Canada in a positive way until now, and until the quarantine plans and COVID that affected everybody, not only Canada, but I mean, we moved after to the 20 hours working for all the students inside campus, and they could not work outside the campus. Then we moved to the work outside campus. And I remember how happy we were because now we were competing with Australia, because Australia had that policy, but Canada didn't have it. And I mean, Canada is relatively new to international education compared to other players like Australia and UK. Then we moved to the postgraduate work permit, and immediately the provinces start working about DLI. So what will be the framework for institutions to become a DLI? And the university that I was working with and for, it was really nervous about how to implement all of these things and duty to care for the students inside the institutions. And then we move into the nomination program by province. So how we can not only graduate students, but they can go into their pathway for the postgraduate work permit and then their provincial nominee. All of those things have been an evolution over many, many years. I mean, I will say 2 decades, right? And we have all start, run, stop, reshift, settle, again, move, being shocked, then implement. And the Canadian brand, I think, over years have been so strong that in spite of all of these changes that have been positive, but some of them have been also negative with our diplomatic relations and the impact of our relationships with China and India and Saudi Arabia, all of those things that have happened over 2 decades really have stand the Canadian brand strong because of institutions and because of all the people who are here today in this webinar have really stand up and speak up on behalf of Canada and on behalf of our institutions, really supporting what we have to offer and the value proposition of our country. So I think that this is not news to me. As Mike and Craig said, this is kind of a resetting and reestablishing the grounds of engagement for Canada. It will be a very difficult road ahead, I think, for all of us as practitioners of international education. I think that being in government, I am not surprised about how this was delivered. I was part of the Saskatchewan government when the quarantine plans policy was rolled out. And I remember the robust discussions among provinces and territories because they said, okay, if the institutions qualify for this quarantine plan, the institutions are going to be on a list and the rest of the institutions are not going to be in this list. And I remember it reminds me a lot of what's happening now. If you have an attestation, your province is out of the gate and we're going to process the applications. But if you don't have the attestation, your province is not going to be out of the gate. So there is a lot of similarities of what's happening right now. And I think that it is a tremendous responsibility and a burden almost to each province to actually administer a process that is complex in nature. I don't know what the process is going to look like. It's just, me speculating, but it's going to be a complex process, I think. I don't know what is the human capacity that each province have to actually administer this process, specifically when your quota is huge for the students, and how they are going to actually be dealing with all the stakeholders. So we have gone from you come, you study, goodbye, have a great life in your country, to now you can come, you can work, and now you can immigrate, but now we're going to verify you, to now we're going to, ask you to show $20,000. So it seems to me like lately the policies have changed, and they have changed in the past few weeks a lot. And I think that the Canadian government is rethinking the entire, life of international education and process here in Canada. But agree with Mike and agree with Craig. I don't think it has been, we have grown in a way that exponentially, in a way that the government hasn't catch up yet with the growth. So right now the solution is, okay, let's stop everything, rather than having all of these international strategies that we have had nationally or federally, over years, implementing some of the aspects of what we want students and institutions to offer to students. We are very focused on, let's market Canada, right? Let's do digital campaigns, let's do diversification, but we have not really thought about it. What is the volume of students we want? How do we want the students to actually live and thrive in Canada? Those are questions that I don't know if my colleagues here in the panel have heard, but I have never heard them yet from the Canadian government when they are stipulating these kinds of strategies for Canada. So that will be kind of my recap on what has happened.
Yeah, thank you, Livia. Well said. Mike, you look like you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, no, I'm just following the thread in the chat and Craig's comments. And I know we were going to go down the hole of trying to anticipate CAP and how attestation letters were going to be administered. But I do think, Craig, your analysis that you'd put in there about, this CAP and how it is administered, and when you factor in secondary students and masters and PhD, might not be as serious. And there's been quite a few questions about how it means for the provinces and also even administering a cap to students who maybe no longer want to come and study here anyways because of the brand damage that was happening before. And I've been cracking a joke. It's like me sending an email to Craig that he's not allowed to date Taylor Swift. Well, that's fine. She wasn't going to date him anyways. And if we're putting caps on students that
we don't know that for sure. We don't know that for
Hey,
sure.
sorry, Craig. It's just an example, right? Just using a metaphor here. But Craig, I think that one chat, maybe should dig down on how you analyze that there?
Yeah, well, it's just the figure that's widely thrown around by and including by the minister and in the official IRCC release is that the cap will result in a 35% reduction in study permits issued this year compared to 2023. And that's true if you just compare the cap to the total figure for 2023. But of course, that total includes a significant number of K-12 students and master's students, which are both of which groups are exempt from the cap. So if you factor those out, the actual reduction required in order to get down to the cap number is more like 17%. But as one of the attendees points out, the current suspension of study permit processing could have a greater effect, right? It could push that number down. It's kind of what you're saying, Mike, is that if it's, in a way, the cap's immaterial if you stop processing study permit applications and discourage people from coming to Canada. So it's hard for us to measure the effect of that at the moment, but that's why I said at the outset that to me, the suspension of study permit processing is a bigger factor than the cap itself. I don't think the cap is on its face like that significant of a factor in terms of Canada's overall position. To me, it's more the suspension of study permit processing and some of the messages that we're sending out to the market around that's especially troubling.
In general, as I look across the sector in Canada over the past couple of years, we've seen that undergraduate recruitment at universities is becoming more and more difficult. And I think colleges, had eaten a lot of the market share from universities, and there was more a push, more course-based masters and those things being offered, which were a lot more competitive. As I look across the provinces, and if I'm sitting in Alberta, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, even the East, I'm feeling pretty good about this, really, because I think with the numbers there, I don't see a massive impact. Obviously, this is targeting, BC and Ontario most significantly, and I think we know that already there's a massive movement in the onshore market in Ontario. Onshore requests are going up massively, and people are looking to move into universities. So I think as Craig, you alluded to, if we took aside the visa processing stop or delay, probably we're not going to see that huge a difference for many schools across in September. what that plans out for the next year or two, we don't know. But overall, I mean, I as I go day by day, I start to feel a little bit better about this. It seems every day, but who knows? More, I'm sure, more announcements to come.
I think you're right. I mean, it's important to be balanced about this. I mean, what we're seeing and what we're feeling most acutely is there's a certain carelessness in the way that this has been handled by the government of Canada. And its impact is greater than the cap. This is what I was getting at earlier, is like you can, like Australia for like the last 4 months has been making significant announcements in a similar vein, right? They have issues of concern in Australia. They enroll very much parallel to what we're seeing in Canada. The foreign enrollment's growing very quickly. There's concerns about students misusing different visa classes and taking advantage of loopholes in the system. Well, there's been discussion about an enrollment cap in Australia, and it's entirely possible that the government will wake up tomorrow morning and do something equally ill-advised, but they haven't done so to this point. And instead, what they've done is they've come forward with much more targeted measures, right? If there's a loophole in the system, let's close the loophole. If there's a type of operator that we're concerned about in one education segment or another, let's address that, right? So it's much more specific as opposed to the kind of blunt instrument of metaphor that we keep invoking for the Canadian approach, right? So it's a, I think that if we could have a candid conversation with Canadian immigration officials over this, they might already be wishing they had done it differently, right?
Yeah.
Because it's so ill-advised and disruptive. And the students, of course, are caught in the middle of all this, in terms of to go back to the question that you started us with, Christine, in terms of, how do we address our own feelings of powerlessness in this respect? I think that, you go back to first, as an international educator, you go back to first principles. You go back to the kind of principles that Mike and Livia were talking about earlier. It's focused on the students and student welfare, right? And the quality of that student experience. And if anything, there's a sharpened focus on the quality of the student experience for every Canadian educator in this moment. And so whether that is the composition of your student body, whether that is the caliber of programs that you're offering to those students, whether it's the quality of student services or housing that you're making available to those students, there's an opportunity for us all to look at what we're doing and seek to improve. I think that's one way. So look, make sure that in an environment of sharpened focus on quality, that your institution and in every respect is responding to that challenge, I think is one way to move forward. Another way to move forward is with consistent, clear communications. When the pandemic, at the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, one of the things that we observed widely was that it triggered a very intense pattern of communication between international staff in institutions and schools and their partners abroad and their students. And unfortunately, that we're all going to have to draw on those lessons in the wake of this announcement, because now we are operating in an environment of profound uncertainty, as we've been describing. And what that means is there's an implied obligation on every educator, every institution and school to lean into those relationships, to communicate excessively with students and partners and stakeholders, both in Canada and abroad, and so that we can all share information that we have, that we can support each other. And this is one of those moments where that support is absolutely critical, and as it was in the early stages of the pandemic. And I'm afraid that we're going to have to live that experience out again now.
Yeah.
I think there's a good point here too about leaving with the lack of consideration to the rollout and the lack of phasing and sort of the need for that surgical rollout. The student experience, going back to first principles, as you said to Craig, which is the student experience, and the reason why many of us got into international education, or if international education has touched our lives, but the student experience has been left out of this these blunt object approach. There's students clamoring, like Mike said, in Toronto, contacting our onshore office. It's just spiked, like absolutely trying to switch programs, panicking. The students to the webinar that I spoke about that we did last Friday, the same thing. So what's the experience of the Canadian brand? Where was that considered in this? It seems like it wasn't. Livia?
I think perhaps, and I just want to speculate, perhaps they were thinking about the Canadian, the student experience internally in Canada, but not perhaps the students that are in the pipeline trying to come to Canada. And for me, a student experience begins in the moment that the student applies to come to a Canadian institution. The care and the communication style and the way that we assist the students and handhold the students to the moment that they arrive here should be part of the Canadian experience. And having thousands of students out there wondering what's going to happen to their future, what's going to happen to all the things that they were planning, to their own application, and the uncertainty that we are all living, as you said, Christine, at the beginning, I just can't imagine. Because coming to Canada as an international student, myself, I mean, many, many years ago, I have to say, is a very stressful experience. And it's a stressful experience for the parents, it's stressful for the student as well, not only for the financial implications, but for the unknown. Am I going to be accepted? Am I going to get the visa? Did I get the documentation right? Am I taking the right flight? All of that encompasses an experience. And I think, to echo what Mike and Craig are saying, I mean, my recommendation to all the practitioners here that I know they know already is over communication is okay. And I think telling students, we don't know, but we're here to support you, means a lot. We don't have to have the answers yet, but we can tell parents and students and also our agent partners that we're here, and whatever it is that we hear, we will be communicating with them, because not knowing is also a good piece of information, and telling people that we don't know is also information. We cannot we cannot say, well, I'm not going to communicate with my students until I know something. No, let's communicate often and clearly so that the students know that we're also on top of this.
And I think exactly, and clarifying the complex when you can, to make it clear, and then letting the students know that it's okay, we don't know right now, but here's the following actions you can take for this step in your journey.
Right.
Okay, just looking at time, I'm going to cover 2 more questions, I think, and then we're going to open. We've got quite a few questions coming in the chat. Speaking of national strategies, so Global Affairs Canada is set to launch their next 5-year strategy in March. So we were lucky enough to have Isaac Garcia-Sitton's recent article. It launched a couple days ago for our new series called Voice of the Sector. He said, as work on the renewed international education strategy continues, we would be remiss to ignore the growing impact of the rapidly evolving immigration policy context and geopolitical factors on international student recruitment and retention. Perhaps equally important is come to an agreement on what are our primary objectives, something we've just discussed, principles, and values that we as a country aspire towards, and what our responsibilities towards the students who choose to study and subsequently stay in Canada. So this strategy is set to, in its 3rd iteration, is set to focus on 4 pillars. So that's digital marketing, scholarships, diversification, and education agents. These are all important, but will any of the work that's been done to date be relevant in today's new world that we're living in? Craig, pass it to you.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any great insight into the forthcoming strategy. I mean, we've contributed to, ICEF has contributed sort of consultation briefs to the process, and we've had some, informal discussions with global affairs officials around the development of the strategy, but we're not really privy to the direction it's taking. I would say that, even at that, we'd have to understand that, I mean, if I was about to release a national international education strategy, and then the Minister Miller's announcement dropped last week, I would put that back in the drawer for a minute and just let the dust settle. And before there's, I'm sure Global Affairs has significant areas of uncertainty, as we all do, around the impact of this new direction from IRCC. And so I think we have to anticipate that this will delay the release of the international education strategy, and that it may even provoke Global Affairs to reopen the process and amend or update the strategy in some way.
Mike?
One comment for me here is just that I hope this doesn't further impact the need for diversity in international student recruitment. And I think, you know, when we're talking about how possibly attestation letters will be given to study permit applications, and if the student doesn't get a permit, that attestation letter is burned, that really concerns me. I know with my company, Illume, we've invested a lot over the past 2 years in diversity markets. I have 22 staff in East and West Africa. I really believe diversity is one of the things that makes Canada strong. And I also believe it makes an international student program strong. And so I'm just worried that we throw the baby out with the bathwater on this, and we give up on the goal to diversify within our international student body as well. So I hope that's really, as we go through with our new strategy, that's really taken into account, because that's the one big concern, another big concern I have with this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, my comments in regard to the strategy or the upcoming strategy are on the same lines as Craig. Navitas North America, we did our brief, we submitted our comments to Global Affairs Canada. It will be nice. It will be a good idea to actually align the strategy to the new parameters of the reality of Canada. Maybe diversification, as Mike says, is a very good angle that we need to take. But also now with the new caps, also will be a diversification inside Canada. Yeah. Right? So pushing also provinces that perhaps their caps are not going to be, we're going to be more favorable, will be a good idea, and focusing on promoting that, but also opening up new markets like Latin America. I think it's important. The visa process and the visa approval for Latin America is really good, and a lot of universities, Canadian universities, are engaged in Latin America, but for most people it's an unknown area where agents are very relatively young and new. That's a different concept. So I think diversification will be good. Alignment between the new policies and also this new strategy will be ideal. But being in government in the past might not happen. But I think actually restraining to launch the strategy also, and rethinking how things will work out will be, that is my recommendation. And also I think, perhaps agent training, agent regulation. I don't think so much about, agents governance and compliance. I'm thinking more about training our agents about the Canadian value proposition, especially because we have other competitors in the global stage like Australia and UK, and we need to get a hold of those relationships and just educate more our partners abroad.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Livia. So I'm gonna, is there any final, before we get into the questions from the attendees, is there any final words of advice? If you could speak directly to students, partners who want to study in Canada, or to institutions who are supporting students who want to study in Canada, what would you say to them? Any final words of wisdom in this difficult moment? Mike?
Yeah, I mean, I think speaking to our colleagues on this call, we've all had chats with each other over the past week. I mean, I spoke to a colleague last week, and I traveled with her 20 years ago. We've been doing this forever together, amazing professional, and her voice was quavering, and she was on the verge of tears when we were speaking, and there's been a lot of stress, people worried about their jobs. And then also just for the fact, like over the last year, for the first time collectively as a group of professionals, we're on our back foot. People are questioning the work that we do, and we're being portrayed in a negative light. And I just want to say, as a community of international educators, we got to remember that the work fundamentally we do is amazing. We change people's lives. We're not out here selling shower curtains. And I look, and I've been doing it for longer than I care to think, but I walk into banks all across BC here, and I see the managers of that branch. She used to be an international student that we did. Just a couple of weeks ago, I went to the house of one of the students that I recruited in 2010, and I held her 4-week-old baby in my hands. And this young woman came when she was 18 to Canada, pursued her education, and now has an executive job in Canada, living an amazing life, has an amazing daughter. And for me, that still resonates to me as what international education is. So when COVID happened, we were all outside of our windows banging our pots and pans in solidarity of what we're doing. Now this feels a little different, where the consequences are significant like that, but we're being attacked a little bit. And I just want us as a group to know that we do amazing work and our industry is awesome, and we transform the communities that we live in, the institutions we work in, and the lives of the students that we bring. So that would be my final message. We got to continue to kick ass.
Awesome. Thank you, Mike. Okay, I think we're going to open it up to questions. We have about 10 minutes left. So I'm going through the questions in the Q&A. There's quite a few. There's people answering on the side. So if we don't get to you here with the panel, hopefully you can get an answer from one of our colleagues who are answering the questions. So the first question is, do you think that the government will prioritize public institutions over the private ones while allocating quotas? Who wants to take this one? I see people smile. I see a lot of smiles.
That's a tough one. That's a tough one.
Yeah. Who do you think?
I think it depends on the province. It's going, it's very clear that under the cap system, some provinces will have room to grow their international enrollment, right? I think Mike alluded to this earlier, and IRCC statements reinforce that point as well, that the cap is going to be allocated on the basis of like the province's proportion of the Canadian population. So if your current foreign enrollment base falls below that proportion, then you're going to have room to grow under that cap system. Other provinces, notably Ontario and BC, I mean, this has been very clearly telegraphed as well. Ontario and BC will see a reduction in study permits available for undergraduate and college students.
Mm-hmm.
So that being the case, it falls to the provinces to determine how those caps will be assigned, right? I don't think the provinces are even at that point yet, from what we can see, right? There's news coverage today to suggest that the BC government is more engaged at the level of provincial to federal discussions around the cap number itself and how it will be applied in BC. So I think they're still trying to work through the details of that, never mind how it's going to be assigned out by institution. If I were a betting person, I would say that public institutions would probably be favored in a formula where caps are going to result in reduced study permit availability in a given province, but it's just way too early to say with any certainty what will happen in that respect.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah.
I saw Bruno's comment of course they will, and I really worry about that, because obviously initial measures have been directly at many of the public-private partnerships. And I look at many of the private operators across Canada, and some of the student experience and student journey and services they provide are among the very top in the country, and they do amazing work. But I mean, I think that has to be the worry. And there's just, I know that this is pro-university over college. I also feel that we will see pro-public over private. And what that looks like, I don't know, but the worry has to be there in my transparent, honest opinion. It's funny, I just looked at my text messages, which was a mistake, because there's all these people commenting on this, and my pronunciation of attestation letter has been noticed and mocked already on this webinar. So thanks for the people that messaged me that.
It's gotten better though, even over the course.
Is it getting better?
Oh yeah, no, totally. It's like anything, like you practice, more you practice, better it gets.
Thanks, Mike. Awesome. Okay, so I think we haven't covered this yet. So let's just talk about it straight on. How do we deal with the bad actors? This term is being thrown around the media, the bad actors. And the same action happened in the 80s, 90s due to the fact that the student agents were abusing the system. The next question. Thank you for the insights. This is connected to the bad actor comment. So I'm going to say Brand Canada. How do you think, or how would you describe Brand Canada was perceived before the announcement last week? Given that there were so much bad publicity from local and national media, why did Canada continue to receive and applicate these record numbers? So maybe we start with the bad actors and then the bad media. So how would we deal with these so-called bad actors in the system? What's the preferred way to deal with that?
Well, I honestly think that some of the measures that have been done do that, but they did it in a very sudden way, and they lumped in people who fall in that category and don't.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is really this is hard for me, because I see a lot of institutions that would be classified as good actors, strong brands, well known across the country and the globe. and really how they support their international students is very poor. They don't respond to inquiries. Students have to send them 3 or 4 emails. They make them wait. They put them on wait lists, all of those type of things. So when I think, that classification of what's a bad actor, and I know in this case is probably saying, look, it's just schools that are essentially ripping students off. There's that factor of it, but it goes back to especially Livia's comments, my comments earlier. It's like, I think it's going to be across the board that everyone's going to have to up their game a lot. And I do think that, we saw in BC that they're not granting any new DLIs over the next 2 years. We're going to see provinces really start to close down. So I think that measure of it is going to be sorted. It's the collateral damage that's associated with that we're going to have to navigate with the biggest impact.
I mean, and I think this is the outcome of not managing properly the institutions and the duty to care to students. And that's was something that I said in my previous comments. If we actually had a strategy and we did have a strategy, but if also we had a mechanisms of regulating all institutions, are they taking care of the students? Do they have the right amount of advisors? Are we responding to inquiries? Are we providing them with housing? Are we giving them opportunities, even if there is no housing outside the campus? All of those student services that are necessary to actually have a student with a better experience. If we did that for many years before today, we wouldn't be in the predicament that we are today.
No,
So
exactly.
we just said, oh, let's get all the students and see what happens. But the infrastructure, the supports, and the processes and procedures that we have as a country perhaps are not sufficient for the volume of a student that we're getting.
In particular areas. And I think we've supported the Brampton Charter. We've recently been to the signing. There you see a charter that's really working with all the stakeholders in the community. It's not just the school, it's not just the government, it's the fire department, it's the medical community, it's the mental health community.
Right.
Sadly, the funeral homes have been involved in that. It's everybody in that community coming together to create an infrastructure for support for students. And I think, to your point, Livia, regulation and compliance and policies and procedures and operational ways of working to ensure that all of these learning institutions are of high quality, that are regularly inspected, and that are able to meet students' needs for all of the needs that they have when they're here. Yeah.
I think the term, frankly, is a bit of a lazy shorthand for a bigger issue, and I think both Mike and Livia are pointing us to it. It's not a matter of public versus private or anything else. It's like, people may understand or think they understand what they mean when they say bad actor, but I mean, really, we have to acknowledge that, if you have grown your international student program too quickly, if you have accepted more students than you can successfully accommodate in any respect in the classroom, in terms of student services, in terms of housing, then you've stepped outside of good practice, right? And when we talk about a return to first principles, that's as much as anything else what we're talking about is like you return to like what is good practice for delivering high caliber student services successfully, right?
Exactly.
That's at an institutional level, at a national level, at a provincial or regional level. That's what ultimately paves the path to a more sustainable future. And I think that this development is a call to all of us to return to with a sharpened focus to those best practices.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Christine, can I read one comment that just came in the chat? And it's from our friend and colleague in Edmonton, Emilio, who many of us work with. And he said, almost 20 years ago, thanks to Livia, I got my first full-time job opportunity as a recent MBA graduate in Edmonton. I'm well on my way to retire at 55 in this beautiful country I now call home, and home of my wife who came with me at the time, and our 2 wonderful Mexican-Canadian teenage boys. A testament that when you have people supporting you, you do things well, everything will work out in the end. And I just feel like that's kind of a beautiful wrap up on like, Livia, you shared your story about your journey here and how much things have changed. And we're trying to also say like, look, this too shall pass. And Emilio, it's a really great comment. And it's testament of people like Livia's work and what we do. And so I just wanted to highlight that one. I thought it was a great comment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's no getting around it. This is a hard moment, but I think it's important to have that broader perspective that the Canadian brand and the quality of Canadian education and the power of that experience of study in Canada is much, much bigger than this, right? So that's a foundation to build on.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's a very heartwarming and hopeful note to end on. Thank you, Mike, for noticing that and sharing it. I want to thank everyone for taking the time to join us today. Thank you to our panelists who shared their experience, their insights, their wisdom with us. I think the community, the larger community in Canada, needed this time to connect. So we appreciate it. The recording will be available and we'll send that out to you. Thanks to everyone. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me at IDP and with any further questions. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Guys.
Okay.
We're good.
We hop into the other thread, I think, Livia,